So this is my reading, commentary, reflections on chapter 27 of the Proverbs. I finished last episode with verse 12, and I'm going to continue now with verse 13. Take his garment, that is surety for a stranger, and take a pledge of him for a strange woman. So let's begin by talking about what a surety is. So beginning with our old Latin roots, we have the word securitas. The prefix se, meaning without or apart from, and then cura, cura, meaning care or concern. So we have without care or apart from concern. Now from the Old French, we have the word seurte, meaning an assurance, a certainty, or a guarantee. That there is this expectation of something being fulfilled. So two interesting concepts here. We have a type of liberation, or away from something, without care, without concern, where the concerning bit would be this binding of responsibility to something. And then in the French sense, we have an assurance. We have almost the opposite, that there is something expected, but it is made the expectation that something will happen or something will be fulfilled is set in a new boundary. It's almost the opposite, in a way, from the Latin meaning. It's an addition, but it implies, I think as we will discover, a third party. Whereas the first, it seems like we're speaking on behalf of the individual, in the Latin sense. We're saying that we are free of concern. We are free of care. But it doesn't say why we are free from this care, this securitas. Something has caused us to be this way, to be secure, to be assured, to have some guarantee of our freedom. And so in the French form, this began to include a legal, financial context, like a pledge or a bond, and this guaranteed some obligation. So this word has a degree of dynamism to it, and I find myself always coming back to this word and really having to think about what it means. And sometimes I find difficulty in coming up with an exact definition. Surety, taking responsibility for somebody else's what? Liberation? Security? Safety? So to reiterate, we have this prefix sur, S-U-R, which means safe or secure. And the surety of the E-T-Y at the end, this denotes a general state or condition. But again, much like the Latin, there is more built in here. For something must give rise to that condition. Something must give rise to the state of being. Moreover, I think regardless of what the state of being is, if it's going to be a stable identity, it has to be safe, it has to be secure. So what I find interesting about this word is that it guarantees a state of being. A surety is a guarantee of a state of being. Take his garment that is surety for a stranger. And so here I had to modify what I thought this verse had meant. For I was thinking that the garment was the thing that was the surety, but rather the surety is implying the guarantor, the person that is performing this action, of providing this degree of safety for the stranger, such that the stranger is not exposed to the eyes of the local people. I'm thinking of a small town situation in the ancient world, where a stranger would be readily identified, even perhaps in a larger town if they dress different. A stranger brings all sorts of potential. And part of this potential, I think, is destruction. It could be in the form of ideas, it could be in the form of another civilization, perhaps, that is spying on this town or city. Any number of reasons. But what is being implied here, what is being suggested, is that we are taking this garment from the guarantor, almost like a double surety, in the sense that this garment that is taken from the guarantor, or the surety, is a fundamental asset. This is not something that this person would want to go out without for long. And so it would behoove this person, the surety, to make sure that the responsibility that they have taken on behalf of the stranger is upheld, in the sense that the negative consequences of this stranger's integration into society will be mitigated. It will be controlled for by this surety. Now, whatever benefit the stranger gets from this situation, I don't know. But I'm thinking about citizenship, for example, or at least a form of citizenship if we're thinking about an ancient image example. The rights of a city, the rights of a town. And I want to reiterate something here. That although the person that is doing the taking, and in this sense, I think it is quite easy to imply that the reader is to fulfill this imagery that I am taking the garment. I'm imagining myself taking this garment. The question being, well, why would I do such a thing if I'm not the surety? I have nothing to lose. I am not responsible for another person's foolish debts. But again, if I'm a member of a society, a part of a collective in which the stranger would bring instability not only to that surety, but also upon me, then I must make sure that the foolish surety is responsible enough not to have his foolishness come and invade my being, So let's think about this for a moment. And when I say think about this, I mean think about it in the sense of prayer, almost. Maybe not almost, outright. That as I enter into this space, I think about my own experience. I think about my capacity as this guarantor, the surety, and I think about my capacity as the prudent person, perhaps, that is looking upon the surety that is taking on a fruitless or potentially dangerous obligation. In the case of the former, in which I am this sort of foolish surety, I'm imagining a situation in my life where I can imagine that this would, in a sense, apply. Perhaps I'm vouching for somebody, I'm giving some recommendation for somebody. In the context of foolishness, in the context of risk, when I consider my own dealings, I reflect on the times that perhaps I have, out of want to help somebody, ignored that which is true about a situation, and I've made a recommendation that showed otherwise. And I think the consequence of that, although small in some cases, large in others, regardless of the scale, I think the consequence of that is that whatever obligation that I am founding, or whatever obligation I am choosing to support, is on something that is other than the truth. And an obligation that is supported by something other than the truth is unstable. Now, perhaps that there are elements of this obligation that are supported by elements of truth, and therefore it may hold, a lie may hold, it may go unpunished. But again, if one is to go through life and in all dealings this way, eventually there will be some poor choices made, and responsibilities will add up. And those poor choices and those responsibilities will be akin to debts, if they're not literal debts, that will come due at some point. And given this accumulative nature, if one is to be continually participating in this way, there is this risk of not being able to pay. And the deficit that would occur from that, the pain and the anguish that would occur from that, I would imagine would be immense, very difficult to overcome. Now I understand I'm taking a few liberties with this word surety, but I think it's necessary. Because the root, the Latin root, it implies something that is a little bit broader. Than just a responsibility for another's performance or undertaking. Now, in the latter case, the situation of the double surety, in which I am now this participant, such that I am trying to keep a foolish guarantor honest in their dealings, because somehow I am connected to this person. Now, it's technically not really a double surety, because the surety that exists in the first instance, like in this verse, take his garment, this is the key here, that is surety for a stranger. The person that is a surety for a stranger. This is the foolish obligation. So, if I'm going to be recognizing this foolish obligation, and I understand that at some point this is likely to come back, or at least there's a probability that this will come back to me, my responsibility now is not to guarantee the liberation of the surety, such that he is now given a certain liberty, free from the negative consequences that would come from the stranger. So, in effect, in that situation, I would be the surety to the stranger. But rather, I would be like a judge of sorts, a bondsman, keeping somebody honest. And I am taking something from them such that now there's this reversal in terms of the surety. Whereas in the first instance, a surety is providing something to somebody. I am taking something from somebody. So let me go back. In the first instance, the surety is providing somebody with something such that they are liberated to do whatever they may need to do. And in return, the surety is responsible for that person's behavior, or the outcomes of whatever the situation might be. And now, according to this verse and the prompting, I take his garment from him. So now, this surety has an additional responsibility, or an additional incentive, such that if he wishes to have his fundamental assets returned to him, he cannot let the stranger run amok. And that could be also forcing this surety to think about things greater than himself, in the sense that he has to imagine the causal chain that can have an effect on others. And if he takes this into concern or to consideration, he will effectively stop this stranger from negatively harming the society. And by that means, the stranger will do whatever he was provided for by the guarantor, and only operate within the bounds that are afforded by that guarantor, whether it be limited monies or limited resources outside of money, whatever that might be, limited access to something. And so here I see this picture forming of a series of dependencies, or a common rule, sort of a common law, I suppose, that one must follow this situation or this circumstance because it is in the interest of this person to look out for the interest of another, because that other person has something that is needed by this surety. Now, I sort of wonder about this, long term, I do think it's an interesting network producing effect. But I would imagine a situation where it could be seen a bit exploitative. But either way, this mechanism by which the foolish surety can bring damage upon the society needs to be controlled somehow. So today is a new day. A new day brings new thoughts. It happens to be a Saturday today. It's a rainy day. A cold and rainy day. Today was somewhat productive. There were areas, as I reflect on it now, that I think could have been better, more that I could have done, more that I could have done to meet my goals, to fulfill those purposes. It happens to be in the evening at the time of recording, as it usually is. My mind tends to be this place. If I can, for a moment, say a couple of things about my current mental state. My mind tends to be this place that ties itself, that can tie itself into knots. It seemingly obscures itself, makes it difficult to see. As though it would prefer not to see, as it would prefer not to see itself, or to recognize its place, to understand that it exists. I've had this experience ever since I was young, and I've never really understood why it was the case. I suppose that's not true. There are a few reasons why it might be the case, but altogether, being well grown now, I find it interesting. I find it fascinating that it remains a part of me that I continually have to work against. Otherwise this cloud will move in and surround me, capture me, torment me. And so as I sit here and I bring this up, I bring it up to say that one of the original purposes for starting this YouTube channel and speaking into the microphone was to open up these clouds, to untangle the mess that is within my mind, because there's a time that I could sit down and I could direct my attention. That is not to say that when I'm not doing this, that I'm not directing my attention. But the attention, in my personal experience, tends to get, again, so wound up and knotted that it takes me a significant amount of time to unwind it, to unravel. And I think about this last recording from the other day, about this business of the surety. I think about our society as it is now, and I understand that my understanding about the way of things is limited, but in my limited experience, I still participate in this world. I'm a part of this unfolding story. There are parts about it that I find beautiful, parts about it that I find exhausting, parts about it that I find infuriating. I see this business of relation in unnecessary growing complexity. That from the standpoint of one particular node in this network, there is this desire to reconstitute, to reorient, to recorrect for the what appears to be quite similar in terms of my own inner mental nodding to the societal, institutional, bureaucratic nodding that limits our action, that disrupts the flow of our monies, which effectively disrupts the flow of our what we find to be valuable in our interactions, our exchanges of such. It bleeds into our very participation with the world, and I think even into our being, the way that we interface with ourselves and others. And while I don't wish to be overly negative here, I do see this, again, this business of the surety as something that has these perennial ramifications. Of course, it's a proverb. It's something that's supposed to be true and applicable to many different situations and circumstances. Take his garment that is surety for a stranger. This controlled liberation of the stranger. And take a pledge of him for a strange woman. So the second half of this verse, we are specifically now tasked at trying to understand the woman's place in this. Before, to be honest, when I interpreted this verse, I thought about some guy knowing somebody else from outside of the locale, of the city walls. He brings him in. Nobody understands him. He looks different from everybody else. He is easily identifiable among the herd. The surety, maybe I could say that the surety went underway. It was undertaken by this person that invited the stranger. But because of the risk, we took something fundamental such that it restricted his what he would allow or offer this stranger in terms of his participation in our society, effectively making him the policeman of his decisions, of his responsibility. But now, the stranger is a woman that he has brought in. Now, what in particular would this mean? Why would it be significant other than a man? And here we have to think of the woman rather symbolically. She participates just like man does in a particular purpose. And in the case of animals, there's been many verses, well, maybe not many, but there's been a few verses that have made reference to a wandering bird or some wandering animal. And the behavior of wandering is something that is not necessarily geared towards their purpose. It could be quite productive, but usually the implication is that the wandering is taking away from what they should be doing. In the case of the bird or the animal, that is to propel themselves, to propel their likeness into the future. And as we think about both man and woman, man has certain unique gifts, endowments, just as the woman does. We are both slightly oriented in a different direction, perhaps temperamentally, in terms of ability, emotionally. We, of course, relate to each other on a fundamental level. We are human beings. Our separation does not deny us all of the shared experiences. It does not deny us, because of our differences, because of the multiplicity, it doesn't deny us unity. And there's a particular way that the woman interfaces, let's say, with society. And here I'm thinking about a fundamental part of her experience. This is sort of the formal aspect of the female, of the feminine, of womanness. One of her foundational purposes is to have children. She has the ability. And it is because of this ability, among other things, which hopefully I'll come to a few others. It is because of these primary purposes. They're fundamental. Because of the primary purpose of childbearing, of all of the emotions and instincts and physiological processes that go into pushing a person in that direction to reproduce. The woman, and in this case her social standing, have a profound impact when she inserts herself into some foreign environment. I think there's some aspect of this that implies that she will have children among foreigners. Putting aside the childbearing aspect, she will participate in a society as a woman does. She will exert her influence as a woman does. In the Proverbs, we are instructed to think of the feminine as one of the arbiters of wisdom. And being in this class, being of this formal disposition, that perhaps she is within the household, she is, in some sense, the builder of the home, whereas the man is the builder of the house. She has a unique responsibility to influence how the fundamental fabric of man's mind, the bedrock of human society, the place in which children are reared, the emotions, the behaviors that are instilled in them, the socialization process. Much of this depends on that feminine as well as masculine, but that nurturing aspect. And this again is all said for a broader purpose here, and that is to identify the effect of bringing, or just generally speaking, the effect of the female human being, or the purpose of the female human being, in society. Well, as before, although I interpreted the first part of the verse as being a man that is a stranger brought into this town, I think it could be seen as more of man in the capital M sense, the human being that is foreign, because it really doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman. They still possess, at some level, the ability to potentially disrupt or bring something in that is unsavory, or the reverse, perhaps. But then when we break it down into the woman and the man, then we have to identify these differences, unique differences. And again, among the woman, she brings with her that possibility of extending her being into the future. And so it's even more of a potential crisis. And so we've taken the garment of this man, who is the surety for a stranger. He is the surety for the woman. So we not only have to take his garment, something that is fundamental to him, that he needs this garment in order to be warm and to cover himself, to hide his shame, perhaps. But also, we need explicitly to have a pledge from him. Now, what does this mean? What is a pledge? A pledge is a solemn promise or undertaking. Now, of this word solemn, we have the implication of a dignified expression, something that is formalized and dignified. Of that which is dignified, we think of something that is composed in a serious manner, something that is composed in a legitimate manner, something that is composed of sincerity. It is true. That the truthfulness of their speech is worthy of respect when it is pledged. And so this is no simple matter. This is not simply instructing the person to say, I will not do this. On some level, I suppose we can call it a pledge. Like a child pledges allegiance to the flag. Doesn't mean that they may actually be making a truthful pledge that would be contradictory, but they may not actually be making a pledge when the child is up there with the hand over their heart. They may just be doing what they're told. But a true pledge is to give us, in this situation, the promise that whatever we are concerned about with this strange woman, that it will not happen. That it is his responsibility, since he is bringing her here, that if she is going to be integrated in this society, it will be done in this way, to avoid this consequence. So I think we need an example here. The question is, well, what is a possibility if this woman, this foreign woman, enters this strange new culture with a man that is from that culture? What potential danger does she bring? Now, setting aside the physical dangers, like bringing in some disease, I think of something more minded. Now, minded could be something that is more universal, that any stranger that is brought into a land can find themselves occupying modes of deception, of pride, and of that protracted or extended from pride, the wickedness. That would be used to manipulate others for the ends of this person. In the sense of the feminine, or the woman, this manipulation of others, perhaps to bear their children, and then to teach them things that are contrary to the culture that she is in. Let's say, for example, that this woman teaches her child that it is okay to rely, or to, perhaps more explicitly, to offload his responsibilities onto everybody else, because we collectively share the burden. Now, if that was said in our culture, this was said in... So, I live in an apartment building. And if there was somebody that moved in, let's say it's this strange woman, and she is using communal spaces for her own purposes, if she is making a mess of the garage, or if she is putting her personal items in the lobby, or doing personal business in the lobby, personal business that is not appropriate to be done in that area. Now, this is a very mild example, but it would cause disruption in terms of the complex, in terms of the association of people that are here. Now, in a much more intimate sense, on a scale of a town or a city, again, this woman marries the person that had brought her in as a child with this person. And the woman has very different views on how the child ought to be related to that society or culture. The child will not integrate very well. And eventually, there will be friction, there will be tension, and there will be conflict. So perhaps not a specific example, but I think we can imagine enough examples or illustrations here to support that point. He that blesses his friend with a loud voice, rising early in the morning, it shall be counted a curse to him. So this is a rather interesting verse. At the outset, I don't quite understand what it means, but we'll begin with the first part of this. He that blesses his friend with a loud voice. So let's go through this word bless and talk about what it means to be blessed. I think most standard definitions of the word bless or blessed would imply some divine favor. Just immediately reflecting on this, if we are to imagine that we are doing this, blessing a friend, I think we run into some issues with position, that I'm not sure that man is in a position to bestow divine favor on somebody. Another way we can think about it, perhaps, that we are praising or worshiping this friend, which might also bring in adverse consequences in terms of where we are placing our attention, the kind of relationship that we have to our friend, and by extension, our relationship to man relative to the divine. Now, the original meaning of the word blessed, in its earliest form, was tied to ritual consecration, often through blood sacrifice. And this consecration is meant to, the word consecration, to make something holy, to make it sacred, to make it an aspect of attention or an aspect of mind that thinks of a particular thing, whatever is upon this altar, let's say, that is propped up to a holy place, that we ought to venerate this thing. This then becomes a place of divine favor. It becomes a place that, and a thing, an object or a person, whatever, that draws attention. Now, to make holy is no simple matter. Again, I come back to that thought that I had a moment ago about how the potential for man to take upon himself the process of blessing, rather than the blessing be bestowed by nature, by God, by a will that extends beyond man. Now, even this definition of the word consecrate I'm not sure that I really like it, because it really doesn't give a solid definition. Of course, to make something sacred, it is important. Again, there are these ideas of orienting attention towards something, reverence. If I am to look up this word sacred, just a quick Google definition, it means connected with God, or dedicated to a religious purpose, and so deserving veneration. I suppose many things can be sacred. I suppose there are things that are better suited to be sacred than others. I would say that the time that I set apart for this experience, the place that I do it in, the manner that I do it in, occupies this consecrated territory. It is sacred in the sense that the purpose of this is to connect to God. It is to bring my mind away from the darkness for which my habitual nature seems more than happy to submit myself to. Now, I'll come back to this idea about man's capacity for blessing another in a moment. He that blesses his friend with a loud voice. What is the significance of the loud voice? Well, to speak loudly, the purpose of doing so would be so that others may hear. Again, another aspect of orienting attention. Not only orients the attention of one's own thoughts, but also of those that are in the relative vicinity. A loud voice can also be something that reiterates importance. It is commanding. It is authoritative. And in this view, it comes to mind again the position of man to bless another, and the authority that is given to him by the divine to do so. I don't much like that language, so I'll rephrase. Man is an interesting creature in the sense that he, among everything that he knows to be, he appears to be this special case in some ways, in other ways not so much, but as far as his mind is concerned, this unique capacity for self-reflection, of awareness, of this sense of metacognition. By this I mean that his mind is capable of rising up out of the primary base condition that he finds himself in. That he can be both a creature of the moment, but also of a creature that sees well into the future and into the past. He can look into himself as an observer and think of his own thoughts. He has great capacity to achieve, but also to deceive himself. And because he is not the agent that knows exactly what he ought to sanctify and when, there is great risk for propping up something or placing the attention into something that ought not to be placed where it is, and attributing goodness to something that is actually less than, I think can cause that trajectory of life and the general process of cognition to be lowered or altered to a state that otherwise wouldn't necessarily be. He that blesses his friend with a loud voice, rising early in the morning. Rising early in the morning, here I think about Genesis, about the role of the evening and the morning. After every day this happens, the evening and the morning. The morning, the introduction of light, the introduction of intelligibility, the introduction of awareness, of creative processing, the transition point between the night and day. And having the self inflated, or the attention turned towards the self, at the beginning, when there has not been any effort in the day to achieve and to produce and to give, I think sets one up for this closed-off, selfish perspective and view of life, that everything will be self-oriented. There also comes into question here a sense of questionable sincerity, questionable sense of the genuine. For I would imagine if I was on vacation with a friend, whatever situation that I would find myself in his presence in the morning, and then right when he wakes up I start to say how wonderful a person he is. This seems out of place. It seems out of place for another man to say to another one at that moment, at that point in time. And as I say, there's this possibility that there is an alternative motive, that there is some lack of truth in the matter, but also again that the attention is going towards praising a friend, whereas the attention ought to be geared towards giving up. Now it's giving up in a way that, since one is blessing somebody else, there is this sense of selflessness in it. But it's selflessness, again, in either a servile manner, such that we are using our productive energies to place upon the altar another man that will not take us to that place of unity. It shall be counted a curse to him. Now this is possible in two ways. That it's either a lie or it's misplaced, again in the sense of attention. In the sense of the former, that lie is not going to serve as a strong foundation for that friendship. To prop and to inflate somebody with false praise is effectively inflating them with poison. And in the second instance of placing another upon that altar, for which man does not place himself there in order to avoid that possibility of self-delusion, of what he perceives as the inner world becoming his entire world, unable to see or to feel or to appreciate or connect with those outside of himself. And it is within this negative aspect of self-praise, I think, that can cause a malformation, a poor opinion within the mind of this friend, such that this overzealous or flattering behavior can produce negative consequences. Again, if it's not genuine, this can ruin the bond of that friendship. A continual dropping and a very rainy day and a contentious woman are alike. So here the imagery that comes to mind is this sense of covering, the sense of inescapableness by this downpour of rain, that there is no way, if we desire to be dry, to achieve that end. contentious woman, a woman that, like rain, just spews forth this continual argumentation, a heated argumentation, produces a sort of covering, like this wetness that leaves one desiring peace but cannot find it. And to be drenched in this argument, within this contention, always having the heart pulled, taut, squeezed, and what emotions come out are primarily negative. Must have a negative consequence on the way in which a person behaves or relates to other people. The mind and the body very much adapt to the forces that are placed on it. And our adaptation, I think, can be rather unfortunate in certain situations. Of the situation mentioned here, in which we are exposed to this continual anger. Or maybe I should just say argumentation, tension. That tension in the mind, I think, offers restrictions. Restrictions on love. Restrictions on beauty. Restrictions on the very thoughts of how these things come to be. One is always in a posture of defense, and one's defenses are always being challenged, damaged, perhaps. After continual and ongoing forces that produce this tension, or as we would imagine, defenses being assaulted. Over time, no doubt damage would occur. Tension would result in fracturing or tearing, defenses weakened. And as I mentioned, the aspect of the sacred self involving the soul, man's relationship to goodness, I think, can be worn down in time. And that by this very relationship, there is this erosion of being. Whosoever hides her hides the wind. And the ointment of his right hand, which bewrayeth itself. So beginning with the first part of this, whosoever hides her hides the wind. Now, who this her is referring to, I think, is interesting. But hiding the wind, I like to start here because it's a rich symbol, the wind. The wind, I think, can be analogous to the Spirit. It can be analogous to God's presence. In Genesis, we have the Spirit or the breath of God hovering over the waters. In Ezekiel, we have the vision of dry bones and the wind bringing life. The life-giving power of God's Spirit. In Genesis 2:7, God breathed life into Adam. Whosoever hides her hides the wind. It hides this life-giving capacity. But moreover from that, I think we have to imagine this physical conception of wind. We experience it as something that is unseen and yet forceful, and that it's something that we can perceive. So in the minded domain, something that is unseen and yet felt is an interesting concept, because there are many things that are unseen and yet felt in terms of everyday relationships. As a matter of fact, today, as I was hanging out with some friends, I noticed that there was this strange, on my part, there was an air of disengagement. For whatever reason, I was not feeling the best today, and my social participation was low. And I could say, as a rather small example, or an example that doesn't have much meaning to it, but nonetheless I think it applies here, that the wind of that experience was felt, I think in a sense, among all of us, that my presence drew away from the general consolidation and goodness of relation, perhaps. That again, my absence, my disengagement, created something that was not seen. Now, of course, my lack of engagement, I suppose, would be seen. But there's a sense in which my lack of engagement created an overcast, a feeling, I think a communal feeling, however slight it may have been, that was oriented negatively. Now, my apologies, but today happens to be a new day. It's a Monday, the first of the week, and it's the evening now after work. A long day has passed. Whosoever hides her hides the wind. I don't think I'm going to return to yesterday's analogy. Not that I dislike it, but I think it's sufficient that it is said the way that it is said. I'm curious now at who this woman is. Whoever hides her. It's likely that it refers to the woman that is in the previous verse. A continual dropping and a very rainy day and a contentious woman are alike. Whosoever hides her hides the wind. And so this combative, argumentative person should be brought into view. We can ask the question, for what reason would we hide contention? Contention being a heated disagreement, or some assertion that is maintained in an argument. So thinking about this contentious person, this sort of assertional force that exists, if we had to define an argument, that exists in this exchange of opposing views. That is there to propagate, perhaps, or highlight the oppositeness, the sort of the contrariness, the contrarian. This is something that can be bad. I think usually a contentious person is said in the negative context. But there can be ways in which seeing the opposites may be beneficial. Hiding this contentious woman, again, hiding that force that highlights the opposite, that brings forth contrary feelings. Well, one may hide this person because contention ought to be away from normal discourse. But that's not really the function of hiding. We would use some other descriptor to describe the removal of this woman and her influence rather than hiding. Hiding is to conceal from view. That if I hid this pen that is in front of me from somebody else, I would not want them to see it. I would not want them to perceive it. And there are various reasons that I may want somebody not to know that I have it. Perhaps I don't want them to take it. Perhaps having this thing may say something about me that's negative, that I don't want somebody else to know. It may prove something about me, provide evidence for a crime that I may have committed. But yet all the same, regardless of the reason, I keep the pen because I desire it, or because there is some relationship that keeping this pen close to me and away from another affords. Now, if this pen was a contentious woman, what would it offer me? And here I think about an unfortunate sacrifice. I was just looking at this word contention, and on its breakdown we have the prefix con, which means with or together. And then we have tent, which means to strive, to aim, or to stretch. Now, the type of contention that implies moving together, an aiming together, a striving together, there is a positive connotation to this. It's not so much that negative connotation that's implied in the verse, or implied just by contemporary language. But one cannot deny, though, in the rooted sense, that whether or not there's this tension, or it is an aim or a striving, it involves these two parties. It involves this woman who is the originator of this process. She is connecting, let's just say myself, since I'm using myself in this analogy. Let's say I'm hiding this person. She is using me, she has chosen me to contend with, to strive with, to aim with, or to stretch, to put tension on something. Her intentions may be negative, they may be positive. But either way, from the subjective standpoint, in my point of view, my heart and its emotions are well directed away from her advance, from her togetherness, from that thread through which she wishes to entangle me. My emotions are pulling me in the opposite direction. And of course, there must be this negative connotation associated with it. There are many painful things in life. I have to think about all the little things throughout the day. This sort of exasperated sense of when will a day be over, when it is only a couple hours into the day. And we've spoken of this sort of thing in this past, this type of thinking. And how this is sort of a contentious thing to bring up within the mind, because it cannot be the way an individual handles a problem to see it negatively all the time. Although the feelings may be directed in a negative place, one must understand and accept the situation that they find themselves in order to deal with those negative emotions. Now, it's possible that because somebody is hiding this woman, this contentious woman, that there is some benefit that within this idea of striving or aiming, or just the plain old tension on something, that something good comes of it, or something rather unhealthy, but all the same challenging. So something that is felt but not seen, we can describe as the wind. We could say also that the wind, as I've said before, has strong association with the Spirit, with God. Doesn't necessarily mean that the wind in this context is referring to God. That's possible. I don't think it means to say that the contentious woman is equivalent to the wind. That because we are hiding her, that would necessarily mean that we are hiding the wind, that therefore would be that she is the wind. I don't think that's the case. We can say that if we are hiding this contentious person, we are hiding that which is felt but not seen. But how exactly to interpret that? We can say perhaps that there is a negative in terms of perception. That there's something that is being reduced of the human experience. To remove that sense of that which is felt but not seen is, I think, a large part of who we are. Our feelings are felt but not seen. It is the removal or the reduction of the heart. I suppose we can ask the question, well, why is it the case? Why is it this removal or reduction of the heart? But if we go back to that example, we put ourselves in the shoes of the person that is hiding this contentious woman, that she is now weaving this web within us, around us, whatever, that is causing all of these taut bands, these taut fibers that are connected intimately to parts of us. And this tension, I wonder how exactly it plays on the heart. But certainly it is, I think, implied that it produces negative emotions. The effect of constant negative emotions on the mind and on the heart is no secret. I don't think it would be very enjoyable, and I don't think it would do any good for one's attention. And to have this almost cancerous being that is constantly interweaving us with this continual exhausting push to recognize things about ourselves that maybe we would not otherwise. In the sense of wickedness, perhaps it is to corrupt our sense of self-worth, or to corrupt our sense of ability. But running with this idea of this woman being responsible for hiding that which is felt but not seen in us, severely reducing our participation or the way that we perceive the world. And we continue into the middle part of this verse, and the ointment of his right hand, which betrays itself. So we are hiding two things. We are hiding the wind, and we are hiding the ointment of the right hand. Two more symbols that we have to identify. Now, an ointment can be seen as an oil, something that is rubbed on the skin. I think of something that is used for medicinal purposes, so it has a healing quality to it. The right hand, another important symbol, a symbol of strength, a symbol of power, a symbol of authority, a symbol of action and skill, a symbol of covenant and agreement. There are many things, I think, that the right hand symbolizes. Power and authority is an important one, and although I don't necessarily think it can be reduced to just that, I think this actionable and yet cultured in a way, cultured in the sense that it has this agentic quality that holds within it power, authority, but righteousness, goodness. It has a strong sense of what action it ought to take. It exercises good judgment. And if we are going to hide the ointment that heals the right hand from when it is damaged, it is again a reduction in the human experience. It is a reduction in the potential for righteousness. And so it would seem that this woman is doing a number to us. And so it appears, becoming increasingly so, that we are hiding this woman almost like an addict or an alcoholic hides his alcohol from whomever he may be living with, his wife, his children, whatever. The last part of this verse, which bewrayeth itself, or betrays itself. I think this both can refer to the ointment in the hand, that what is meant to be this medicinal substance has now become poisonous. And he that hides the woman hides the wind betrays us, because, again, that which is felt but not seen, the removal of perception, a particular type of perception. And so we have this removal of this type of perception, but also the removal of our ability to act, our position, the authority that we do have. And if we don't have much, then it is our will at the very basic level. That all of these various threads and tensions that are placed by the contentious woman, although in some sense we can imagine, in terms of the rooted sense, that there is this possibility of striving with, such that we are accomplishing a goal together with somebody. The contentious woman, in the negative sense, what she does is incessantly provide this knotted web of tension, such that it perverts the mind, it destroys the attention of the individual, it destroys the will, it destroys the heart, it disrupts that very perceptual capacity to feel that which is not seen. It disrupts the very ability to participate, to have willful agency, because the very mechanism by which we are able to extend that will is disrupted by this network of tension and opposition. Iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friend. So iron sharpens iron. What is to be said of this imagery? That we have two like substances, and we are saying that they sharpen each other. That because of their likeness, because of their similarity and hardness, that they are endowed with this capacity. And we can imagine that if one was not iron, but let's say that it was this substance was beneath iron in its likeness, which would be beneath it in certain qualities. If that was the case, then likely the substance would not be sharpened. The inferior substance would likely be broken. Now, on the other hand, I'm not so sure that the other direction applies, in the sense that if there was a substance that was elevated above iron, that was sharper perhaps, We could say either that it would break it or that it would improve its condition, because this new substance is harder than iron. So of course, the prior substance will not bend or break because of it. But this explanation, I think, is a bit too material. And I don't think it's exactly on the mark. I think the important part here has to do with likeness. And of likeness, something that is of a shared quality. Of quality, we have something that is equivalent to the characteristics of something. Of quality, we have some formal standard, some reference point for something is to be something. If man is to be something, there are certain things, there are certain characteristics that form him, that support his identity. Without them, he would not be man. And of course, there's variability in man. There's multiplicity in the unity. But the fundamental parts are necessary, again, for that intelligibility to exist. And so if we say that identity, regardless of what it is, whether it be iron or whether it be a close friend, I think out of everything that is whole, we can find various parts. And we could take various parts out of something that is whole, and we would not be able to recognize that as a characteristic of something else, if it's fundamental enough, because it is shared among so many different things. So for example, if I take iron, I'll use a physical example, and I take an electron from this substance, and then I expose it to the view of somebody else, and I say, well, what element is this from? It would be nearly impossible to say, other than just guessing, because that electron, that fundamental particle, is shared among all atoms. And yet, it is within the way in which the fundamental elements are organized that makes this difference. In terms of the likeness of the iron and the sharpening and all that, I'm sure that there are other substances that can sharpen iron. I don't think that's the point. You see, I think there's a danger in identifying too strongly these material causes and associating them with verses that are meant to be more symbolic. And so, for example, when we are speaking about iron sharpening iron, as I've mentioned, there are plenty of materials that can be used to sharpen iron. But what we are after here is the declaration, the statement that likeness, when paired appropriately, has the ability to improve the purpose of its kind, let's say. Now, that'll take some time, I think, to describe. So in terms of this, the iron that is sharpening itself, there are many forms of iron that do not require sharpness. So I think what is being suggested here is that we are probably talking about a sword, something that is sharp, a dagger, whatever. But herein lies, I think, an important point. The verse doesn't say that it is a sword or a dagger. There is a form of implication because of this adjective of sharpness, or the verb to sharpen. Iron sharpens iron. But we can just as easily fill that category with any verb or adjective. Some purpose, in a sense. We could say that iron builds upon iron. We could say that iron fights iron. And I think we can take any number of examples. I could take the number 1 and split it into 2, in the sense that I have 2 separate ones. I happen to have written them down on this paper. I could say that 1 sharpens 1. But more fundamentally, I can say that 1, in the base sense, again, of any old pen writing any old number 1 on a page, and saying that this number 1, given some purpose, either positive or negative, now, on the flip side, just as we say iron sharpens iron, we have 2 cases of likeness. In the downstream sense, after the iron has been sharpened by the iron, the kind has been modified by some kind. 1 has been changed now from basic 1 to 1 with purpose. Again, either positive or negative. Positive in the sense that I can say that I have 1 pen. Sharpened iron. I can say that I have -1 pen. Still 1. Still 1 in kind, but of something of an identified, farther identified characteristic. It is in some sense, a type of building of concepts where this would be quite difficult if all we were to focus on is the fact that, in the physical sense, that this material, iron, is sharpening another piece of metal. While that may be the case, the primary purpose here is examining 2 things of a kind, sharing characteristics, affording certain things, given some intervention, given some purpose, again, positive, negative. Iron base, sharpening, which would be the purpose, positive purpose, and sharpened iron in the form of a sword. Much improved in terms of the subjective understanding. So iron sharpens iron. So a man sharpens the countenance of his friend. Now I think the second half of this verse is quite beautiful, in the sense that if we were before to be a bit confused and to be a bit overly material in our understanding of how to interpret iron sharpens iron, we have no question but to reconcile that second half of the verse. Because a man sharpening the expression of a friend doesn't seem to make much sense on its face. No pun intended. Now here I'd like to consider this word countenance. Starting from the Latin root, we have computare, meaning to reckon or to account. The connection to count involves reflection or expression. Additionally, we have the Latin word contenere, meaning to contain or to hold together, with the prefix cum, or together, and tenere, meaning to hold or to keep. From the evolution to Old French, we have continence, meaning behavior, demeanor, or appearance. From Middle English, we have a facial expression, the outward display of one's feelings or mood. Again, demeanor, retaining the Old French, or bearing, one's conduct or attitude. Support or approval, to give one's countenance to something was to support or to permit it. In the modern context, this word countenance has narrowed. It commonly used to refer to facial expressions, or support or approval. But all of these, I think, relate to the Latin root, and I think there's an important stabilizing factor here within those Latin roots. That of the coming togetherness, or something that holds something together. And a facial expression, when I think of the relatedness to that, the old roots of the word, I think of how the face is an extension of that which is held together, in the sense that of the subject, of the person, they are constituted in various ways. The emotional aspect, the emotional side of the human being, is quite constitutional. The expression of these emotions are transmitted through the face. There are many things that one can tell about a person given their facial expressions. So to reiterate, starting with these roots, the foundational roots, we have this idea of something that is coming together. But what exactly is coming together? If we look at someone's face, we can see this from a few different angles, perhaps on the part of the person that is expressing, or on the part of the person that is observing. But I think what is common in both situations is that what is coming together is the amalgam of thought, such that emotions are attached to reasons and a particular expression. I had a situation earlier today in which I was trying to do something humorous, but it really didn't land and it was kind of embarrassing. It was more of a behavior or a gesture. And I received a reaction, a facial expression, that I was not expecting, and it sort of made me a bit embarrassed. And what came together in that moment was not only in me a recognition and understanding that I probably shouldn't have done what I had done, but also a strong understanding of what the person was thinking, what the person was feeling, and moving away from just that rooted sense of coming together, holding some thought in the face, keeping it in the face. What also comes to mind is attention. Because if I say something about the countenance being upon somebody, it's more about attention. It's about the orientation of the face, not necessarily about the emotion or the facial expression, although that's also important. So the rooted sense of coming together, bringing information together such that it's readily recognizable by another, but also orientation of attention. So if we imagine this descriptor, this characteristic of sharpening one's countenance, I think, in effect, what can be said about this is that one's emotions, one's expression is filtered in a certain way, such that of one's behavior, of one's actions, their expressions are appropriate. And to sharpen, as I was saying before, I think there is an implication of increasing the utility or the purposefulness of such a thing. And to increase the purposefulness of one's expressions, I think delves into wisdom to a degree. It delves into the appropriateness of an expression given a particular context, which is quite useful, especially in a professional environment. Saying the right things, or doing appropriate things, or doing something that is required of one, maybe despite sort of a dogmatic standard. I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but my mind is just thinking generally about the appropriateness of attention and of behavior, and by extension of that, the expression on one's face. And I don't think it's any far stretch to imagine how sharpening such a thing would actually be sharpening the mind, and how this sort of effect would benefit the person that has this done to them, the sharpening. Much like the iron that is made better to exact its purpose for cutting, let's say, by being physically sharper. The mind, and by extension the countenance, one's attention, one's focus, one's behavior, one's participation with others, all of this is improved. It's enlightened. Okay, so we've talked about this term countenance. Now the remainder of this, I think that's important to explore, is the relationship here. So we have two types of kind in this equation. We have kind, which is some variable given to some purpose, which has a positive or a negative associated with it, influences something else of a kind. That is the standard equation that we are introduced to with the iron sharpening iron. In the case of the second part of this verse, we have man that is sharpening his friend, or man that is sharpening man. He's sharpening a particular aspect of man. In the case of iron, there's not really so much that you could sharpen, because it's quite a simple structure. But in terms of man, there are plenty of things that can be sharpened. But the countenance is quite widespread. That is really the business end of the blade, so to speak. What I find interesting here, that unlike the first part where we're talking about iron and iron, two relatively similar things, we're given some extensions in the second half. It's not just man and man, it is man and friend. It is not just man sharpening friend, it is man sharpening the countenance of a friend. Again, the specific aspect that I had mentioned. And I suppose there can be some things that can be said about, well, why is it the friend? Maybe why is it not somebody, some random person? And I think that having a stronger bond is like having a larger road. It just facilitates more traffic of information, of feelings, of just generally connectedness, such that the type of fundamental change that one would expect at the level of countenance, or again, of attention, which is very fundamental to the way that people experience life and themselves. This sort of thing, I think, intervening at this level is made simpler if one as a friend, again, because, as I've mentioned, there are certain affordances there are certain bonds given that relationship that allow it. Whoso keeps the fig tree shall eat the fruit thereof. So he that waits on his master shall be honored. So I'm thankful for the last verse, in the sense that when we were introduced to that first equation about the iron sharpening iron, there was an unfortunate thing that I tend to get into that takes me away from the spiritual dimension, which is interpreting everything in this materialistic framework. Not that a material understanding of things is bad, but in terms of being spiritually grounded, it puts up blinders, I think. And so moving into this second verse, I want to approach it in the same manner, with the same things in mind. So a rather strange verse, archaic in some ways, but still, like with all verses, we have to try our best to make a modern illustration of this. And I think there's plenty to be said, especially in the second half, about the relationship of a subordinate and a master. But given the first part of this, we have some agent combined with some behavior, plus something that gives us a witness to the result, or the consuming of the result. Kind of a simple introductory part of this verse. Something that we all learn with age. That if we want something out of something, we have to take the time, move ourselves productively, behave such that when we encounter something, that we are in a position to benefit from it. So, for example, I'm thinking about work. If we wish to be successful at something, we have to continually learn and grow. And we have to facilitate that growth, which requires steady behavior over time, such that, or analogous to the fruit tree that is being, or the fig tree that is being cared for, consumed. A lot of time goes into growing plants. A lot of care, a lot of attention. For this keeping here, I don't think just implies to have in one's possession. I think it implies to have in one's possession, but also to care for, which again involves all of that stuff that I had mentioned. It involves time, it involves attention, it involves knowledge of understanding the soil that it is in, the nutrients that it requires, and how to interact with it. Because certainly it can be the case that we take more than we need from the tree. Perhaps not necessarily in terms of the figs, but we may stunt its growth. We may intrude on the environment that is necessary for it to be something that would allow us to be enriched by it. And so there's this sense of patience and of observation that's involved in that. In a like manner, when we find ourselves in this position of subordination, and here I think of a few things. I think of sort of an unfortunate example, a situation I think that we are facing now, having to do with the change in governance of the United States, from something that was traditionally was hallowed as a Republican democracy, and now it is turning into, or has already become, an oligarchy. And in all political systems, there is this relationship between the servant and the master. Even if the person is liberated, in a sense, from the earthly master, that of another person, he will always be in some relationship where he is lower on that scale, that he'll have to submit himself to something, whether it be the law, the common law, or whether it be to something on a more cosmic scale, a divine law, whether it be the law of his family, or what have you. Now, this master and servant relationship, I think, is an interesting one, a complex one. I don't think in all situations it implies this excessively servile attitude or behavior. Here I think of a kind of a funny example or analogy in terms of a servant that is not necessarily of the peasantry, of that class as we would imagine a peasant to be, sort of unkempt, illiterate, perhaps rude in manners. Here I think of Alfred in Batman. He is the famous butler, and he is a servant of the estate, but he has this strong role of protectorate of Batman, and also of a position of this strong, close, personal friend that looks out for his best interests. Because the success of his master in some sense translates to the success of himself. Now, of course, in these terms, seeing things in these terms, it's a bit abstracted away from that personal experience, that Alfred is not doing what he does because he expects to be in a better place or condition, although that may be a consequence of his behavior. The primary thing is that he is able to witness, or he is able to consume the result of that behavior. Now, that result again can be monetary, or what he gains from it, that he still is allowed to live on this fancy estate and whatnot. But it can also be in the sense that he is more enriched in the soulful sense. He is enriched in the sense that he strengthens the bond of a very unique, disciplined, virtuous person. And by doing so, he not only, I think, gains reciprocally in this virtue, but also is able to exercise his own virtue on a highly influential person. So there's this reciprocal relationship there that's in the positive. So I think I'm going to end this episode here. I'm going to continue next time with verse 19. Until next time.